You can drink coffee every single morning, feel alert, feel productive, feel completely fine, while a specific hormonal collision is quietly accelerating cellular aging in ways that won't show up on a standard blood test for years. That collision has a name, it has a mechanism. It is happening right now in millions of people over 55 who have never been told about it because the advice you've received about coffee was built around the metabolism of a 35-year-old. And it is not the coffee itself, it is when you drink it and what you put in it and what those two choices together are doing to your cortisol rhythm, your insulin, your vascular tissue, and eventually the protective caps on your chromosomes. By the end of this, I'm going to give you something called the 90-minute car reset. Three specific changes that cost nothing and restructure the entire hormonal sequence of your morning. But first, you need to understand exactly what you're working against, stage by stage, from the moment your alarm goes off. Here is the number that changes everything. Your body's primary stress hormone, cortisol, rises between 50 and 100% in the first 30 to 45 minutes after you wake up. Not because you are stressed, not because anything is wrong, because you are alive and your biology is running a precise startup sequence. This is called the cortisol awakening response. Think of it as your body's internal irrigation system. It turns on automatically at dawn, sends a precisely calibrated chemical signal through every major organ system, sharpens executive function in the prefrontal cortex, mobilizes glucose from your liver's glycogen stores, raises core body temperature, upregulates immune alertness, and tells every cell from your heart to your fingernails, "We made it through another night. Let's operate." This is not a stress response in the bad sense of the word. This is a survival mechanism that has been running in human biology for as long as we have existed. It is one of the most important biological events of your entire day. And what do most people do in the first 15 minutes after it starts? They pour caffeine directly into it. That is the mistake, and after 55, the consequences of that mistake compound in ways that are specific to an aging hormonal system, not just inconvenient, not just suboptimal, but biologically measurable in terms of how fast your tissues age. Here is what the first stage actually looks like in detail. You wake up. Your hypothalamus, the control tower sitting at the center of your brain, fires a chemical signal to your pituitary gland, which relays it to your adrenal glands, two small triangular structures perched on top of your kidneys. Within minutes, cortisol floods your bloodstream. Your liver begins releasing stored glucose, your heart rate increases slightly, your blood pressure rises to its morning operating level, your brain transitions from the slow, restorative wave patterns of sleep into the sharp, wired electrical activity associated with decision-making and language. You did not consciously initiate any of this. It happened on its own, the way it has happened every morning since before you were born. The cortisol awakening response peaks at roughly 30 to 45 minutes after waking in most people, and then begins a gradual, clean descent through mid-morning. Think of it as the first shift at the factory. The first crew handles the startup sequence. They flip all the switches, calibrate the machines, bring the building up to temperature. This crew is precise. It knows exactly what it's doing. It does not need help. If you send a second crew through the door before the first crew has finished its sequence, you don't get twice the output. You get interference. Caffeine is the second crew arriving 30 minutes too early. Here is the specific mechanism. Caffeine works by binding to adenosine receptors in your brain. Adenosine is a sleepiness molecule. It accumulates throughout the day, building what researchers call sleep pressure. The longer you are awake, the more adenosine accumulates, and the more persistently your brain signals fatigue. During sleep, your brain's glymphatic system, a kind of biological sewage network that operates mainly at night, clears the adenosine backlog. When you wake up, adenosine levels should be relatively low, and your cortisol is already high. At that moment, you should theoretically feel alert without any external assistance. Caffeine does not destroy adenosine. This is critical, and almost no one understands it correctly. Caffeine occupies the receptor site. It sits in the docking bay and blocks the adenosine molecule from landing. Like placing a piece of tape over a smoke detector, the smoke is still in the room. The alarm simply cannot ring. When caffeine eventually metabolizes and clears from your system, the adenosine that was blocked is still waiting and it floods the receptor sites all at once. That is the mid-afternoon crash. It is not low blood sugar, although blood sugar dysregulation can make it worse. It is the adenosine debt coming due, all at the same time. Now, here is where age becomes the central variable. Before 55, the adenosine debt tends to resolve itself overnight without causing downstream problems. After 55, two metabolic realities change this picture significantly. First, caffeine metabolism slows with age. The half-life of caffeine, the time required for your body to clear half of a given dose, can extend from 4 to 6 hours in younger adults to 6 to 9 hours in older adults. Based on research published in the European Journal of Clinical Pharmacology examining cytochrome P450 enzyme activity, which is the liver enzyme family responsible for caffeine breakdown. What this means practically, the coffee you drink at 7 in the morning may still be partially biologically active at 11 at night. Most people over 55 attribute their difficulty falling asleep to stress, or aging, or anxiety, and never consider that the coffee they had at 3 in the afternoon is still occupying their adenosine receptors 8 hours later. Second, and this is where the aging mechanism gets serious, your adrenal glands are no longer running at the hormonal output capacity they had at 30. The adrenal system is exquisitely sensitive to overcorrection. When you add artificial stimulation on top of the cortisol awakening response every single morning, day after day, month after month, the system recalibrates. Your body registers the consistent presence of external cortisol elevation from caffeine and begins to reduce its own production. The natural morning cortisol response flattens. The automatic irrigation system receives a daily message. The external water source is handling this. We don't need to pump as hard. This is the invisible villain in today's script. The gradual, undetectable blunting of the cortisol awakening response. And here is why that matters for more than morning energy. A blunted CAR has a specific symptom profile that most people never connect to their coffee timing. You wake up feeling genuinely groggy, almost confused, for longer than seems reasonable. You do not have a sense of natural morning alertness at any point. You go from asleep to needing coffee with nothing in between. The idea of waiting 90 minutes for caffeine sounds not just inconvenient, but physically impossible. That feeling of impossibility is not a personality trait. It is evidence of a cortisol rhythm that has been progressively suppressed by years of early caffeine overriding it. But the KR is not just about energy. This is the part of the story that connects morning coffee timing to cellular aging, and it is the part that mainstream health advice has almost entirely missed. Cortisol, when it runs its natural morning cycle correctly, rising steeply, peaking cleanly, then declining in a smooth arc, acts as a potent anti-inflammatory signal throughout your body. The morning peak tells your immune system, stand down from the overnight maintenance mode. We are entering active operating hours. Keep systemic inflammation under control. The gradual, orderly decline through mid-morning reinforces that signal continuously. People with well-regulated, robust cortisol awakening responses tend, as a population, to show lower baseline markers of systemic inflammation. When the CAR is chronically suppressed, which is what happens when you override it with caffeine every morning for years, you lose that clean anti-inflammatory arc. Baseline inflammation creeps upward, slowly, imperceptibly, in a pattern researchers at the University of Bologna, who have spent decades studying the biology of aging, have named inflammaging. Inflammaging is not a dramatic inflammation event. It is low-grade, systemic, persistent inflammatory signaling that hums at a level just below what standard clinical tests typically flag. And inflammaging is now one of the most strongly supported mechanisms of accelerated cellular aging in the scientific literature. It accelerates the shortening of telomeres. Telomeres are the protective caps on the ends of your chromosomes. Think of them as the plastic tips on the ends of shoelaces. Every time a cell divides, those tips get fractionally shorter. When they erode to the point where the chromosome itself begins to fray, the cell either stops dividing or triggers its own death. This is the cellular clock of biological aging. Chronic inflammation accelerates that shortening. Alyssa Eppel, a researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, who has spent over 2 decades studying telomere biology and stress physiology, has published extensively on the association between HPA axis dysregulation, disruption of the very cortisol-producing system we've been discussing, and accelerated telomere shortening. The research does not say coffee ages your cells. It says disrupting the natural cortisol rhythm, which is precisely what poor caffeine timing does, is associated with the kind of sustained stress signaling environment that shortens those protective caps faster than they should shorten. That is the mechanism, not a vague warning. A specific biological chain, early caffeine, blunted CRA, lost anti-inflammatory arc, elevated chronic inflammation, accelerated telomere shortening. Now let's move forward in the morning, because the cortisol timing issue is not the only problem running in parallel. Most people over 55 do not drink black coffee. They drink coffee with something in it. Cream, half and half, a flavored liquid creamer from a plastic bottle in the refrigerator door. Some of the most popular flavored creamers on the market, Coffee Mate Natural Bliss, International Delight's various seasonal varieties, contain in a realistic 2 to 3 tablespoon pour anywhere from 8 to 14 grams of added sugar. That is the sugar content of 3 Oreo cookies. Those same creamers often contain hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oils, corn syrup solids, and artificial flavoring compounds. The serving size printed on the bottle is 1 tablespoon. Ask yourself when you last measured 1 tablespoon into your coffee and stopped there. This is not a moralistic point about sugar. This is a hormonal architecture point. When you consume 10 grams of sugar before 7:30 in the morning, you spike insulin. Your pancreas releases insulin in response to the glucose entering your bloodstream. Insulin's job is to signal cells to take glucose up from the blood. It does this effectively, but insulin also does something else that is critically relevant to what happens to your body after 55. It signals your fat cells to store, not release. Specifically, insulin suppresses a family of enzymes called hormone-sensitive lipases, the enzymes responsible for breaking down stored fat and releasing it as usable fuel. As long as insulin is elevated, your body cannot access stored fat as an energy source. That is not a diet opinion. That is cellular pharmacology. Here is why this is specifically worse after 55. Insulin sensitivity, how efficiently your cells respond to insulin signal, declines with age. Research from the National Institute on Aging has documented this decline beginning as early as the mid-40s and accelerating after menopause in women and alongside testosterone decline in men. A sugar load that your body handled efficiently at 35 now produces a larger insulin response and a longer return to baseline at 58. More insulin, circulating for longer, every single morning. Now add the cortisol. Your cortisol awakening response is already peaking. Cortisol and insulin together, both elevated simultaneously, are documented in the metabolic literature to preferentially drive fat storage toward visceral deposits, not subcutaneous fat, the kind you can pinch. Visceral fat is stored around and inside your abdominal organs, around your liver, packed between your intestines, close to your heart. Unlike subcutaneous fat, visceral fat is metabolically active tissue. It secretes its own inflammatory compounds called adipokines. It communicates with the liver in ways that raise serum triglycerides, lower protective HDL cholesterol, and amplify systemic inflammatory signaling. The more visceral fat accumulates, the more inflammatory the signaling environment becomes, which loops back directly to the telomere shortening mechanism we discussed earlier. The cortisol and insulin combination early in the morning is, in the metabolic literature, sometimes referred to as a double hormonal hit. And if you are over 55, drinking sweetened creamer in coffee within 30 minutes of waking, this double hit is happening in your body every single morning, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. This is the point in the script where I need to say something that took me years to fully absorb. We have been told, for as long as most of us can remember, that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. that eating in the morning kickstarts the metabolism, and that delaying food intake is extreme or risky. Those messages were not generated by nutritional scientists working disinterestedly on human health. The phrase breakfast is the most important meal of the day was popularized in the early 20th century through marketing campaigns by cereal manufacturers, Kellogg's and Post, documented in advertising history and confirmed in reporting by major publications including The Guardian. The grain and cereal industry later funded research that consistently demonstrated the benefits of breakfast consumption, research that, when examined by independent researchers who had no financial relationship with the food industry, did not consistently replicate. The actual scientific literature accumulated over the last 30 years tells a more nuanced story. Multiple large-scale studies, including research published in the New England Journal of Medicine and work from Sachin Panda's laboratory at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in San Diego, have demonstrated that compressing the daily eating window and allowing an extended overnight fast produces measurable improvements in insulin sensitivity, inflammatory markers, blood pressure, and the activation of cellular repair processes. Panda's research has been particularly influential in establishing that the timing of food intake is a biologically significant variable independent of what the food actually contains. When you eat matters, not in a vague circadian wellness sense, in a measurable tissue-level biological sense. I think about this every time I make morning coffee now. My husband used to eat before 7 every morning. Eggs, toast, coffee with cream. His blood panels were telling a story we weren't reading correctly at the time. The food was not inherently bad. The timing was suppressing metabolic signals his body needed to run correctly. His recovery after his health crisis, which was supervised, which took time, and which I want to be responsible about describing because his results came with medical oversight and individual results genuinely vary, involved rebuilding the hormonal architecture of his day from the first hour forward. Let's follow the morning a stage further because the downstream consequences of the hormonal collision extend well past 10 in the morning. By mid-morning, around 10 or 11, your cortisol is supposed to have declined significantly from its peak. In a well-regulated system, this decline is gradual and clean. The first shift crew finishes its startup work and hands off to the mid-morning operating team, which runs on naturally declining adenosine, moderate dopamine activity, and the stable, slow-burning energy that comes from well-managed blood glucose. When the morning went wrong, caffeine on top of cortisol, insulin spike from creamer, this handoff is disrupted. Cortisol does not decline as cleanly. Insulin may still be elevated. Blood glucose is oscillating. By 10:30 or 11, a significant proportion of people in this hormonal state experience what they interpret as hunger, or low energy, or brain fog, or a craving for something sweet. What they are physiologically experiencing is reactive hypoglycemia. Blood glucose rose quickly from the sugar hit. Insulin overshot the correction. Glucose drops below the comfortable operating range, and the brain, which runs almost exclusively on glucose, and which cannot store more than a few minutes' worth of fuel on its own, sends out an alarm signal. That alarm presents as, get food, get caffeine, get sugar. Most people respond, a mid-morning snack, a second coffee. The cycle re-enters. Here is the aging consequence of that cycle. Every time blood glucose rises sharply and then drops sharply, a pattern researchers call glycemic variability, there is a measurable increase in oxidative stress inside your cells. Oxidative stress is the imbalance between free radical production and your cell's antioxidant capacity. Free radicals are reactive oxygen molecules that, in small quantities, serve normal signaling functions. When they are produced faster than your cellular defense systems can neutralize them, they damage cell membranes, degrade mitochondrial DNA, and accelerate tissue aging. Think of free radicals as sparks from a fire. Steady, controlled combustion produces manageable sparks. A fire that surges and dips unpredictably throws sparks in all directions, faster than any crew can contain. Research published in the journal Diabetes Care has demonstrated that glycemic variability, not just average glucose level but the amplitude of daily swings, is independently associated with accelerated vascular aging. Your blood vessels age faster under conditions of repeated glucose oscillation, even when your fasting glucose appears completely normal on routine testing. This is a critical piece of information for anyone who has had blood work come back looking fine and assumed their metabolic health was under control. Your fasting glucose is a snapshot. Your glycemic variability is the film. And the film, for most people eating the standard American pattern with a sweetened morning coffee, shows daily spikes and crashes that your arteries are quietly paying the price for. Arterial stiffness, the structural consequence of accelerated vascular aging, is one of the most consequential physiological changes of post-50 biology. Stiff arteries cannot buffer the pressure waves generated by each heartbeat as efficiently as flexible ones. This raises systolic blood pressure mechanically, forcing the heart to generate more pressure with every beat. It also reduces the speed and volume of blood delivered to the brain. Research from the National Institutes of Health has linked arterial stiffness, measured by a metric called pulse wave velocity, to increased risk of dementia and to faster hippocampal shrinkage of the brain region most critical for memory consolidation and spatial navigation. There is a straight line from morning glucose oscillation to vascular aging to reduced brain blood flow to cognitive decline. Not a dramatic sudden event, a slow, invisible daily erosion. There is one more mechanism I need to explain before I give you the protocol, and this one is the one that connects everything most directly to the speed at which your cells are aging. Autophagy is the cellular cleaning process your body runs when it is not occupied with digestion or nutrient processing. The word comes from Greek and means, literally, self-eating. When your cells are in a fasting state, when insulin is low, when no significant macronutrients are entering the system, a specific family of proteins activates the cellular janitorial function. The cleaning crew moves through each cell, identifies damaged proteins, oxidized lipids, broken mitochondria, and accumulated biological debris, breaks these down, and recycles the usable components. It is your body's most sophisticated anti-aging mechanism, operating at the level of individual cells. This is not a fringe wellness concept. Yoshinori Osumi, a cell biologist at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2016 for his foundational work describing how autophagy works at the molecular level. The Nobel Committee specifically cited its relevance to aging, cancer, and neurodegenerative disease. This is core biology, peer-reviewed, Nobel-validated. Autophagy cannot operate when insulin is elevated. The presence of insulin is a signal to the cell that feeding mode is active. Building and storing are the priorities. Cleaning must wait. The cleaning crew and the building crew cannot run simultaneously in the same space. When you drink sweetened creamer and coffee before 7 in the morning, you spike insulin and you switch off the cellular cleaning process during a window when it would otherwise still be running from the overnight fast. The janitorial staff, mid-cycle, gets sent home early. The damaged proteins and oxidized cellular debris that were mid-breakdown get left where they are, accumulating until the next low insulin window arrives. For most people eating multiple meals and snacks throughout the day, that window may not return for 20 or more hours. Black coffee, coffee with nothing added, or with a very small amount of fat, like a single tablespoon of heavy cream, does not produce a meaningful insulin response in most people. A splash of heavy cream contains negligible carbohydrates. The insulin response it generates is not sufficient to meaningfully suppress autophagy in the way a sugar-containing creamer does. This is why the what you put in it question is as important as the timing question. You can wait 90 minutes and still interrupt autophagy if you add enough sweetened creamer. Conversely, black coffee timed correctly is not only compatible with an extended fasting window, it may actually support it by mildly increasing norepinephrine, which modestly upregulates fat oxidation. A note about artificial sweeteners in coffee, because this comes up constantly. The narrative that artificial sweeteners are metabolically neutral, that they satisfy sweetness without any downstream effects, is not well supported by current evidence. A 2014 study published in the journal Nature showed that artificial sweeteners altered gut microbiome composition in ways that impaired glucose tolerance in some participants. A larger meta-analysis published in the British Medical Journal in 2023 found that regular artificial sweetener consumption was associated with increased cardiovascular risk, with the association being strongest for aspartame and acylphenone potassium. The mechanisms are still being investigated, but the idea that you can pour a few packets of artificial sweetener into your morning coffee and remain biologically neutral is not a safe assumption, And if you are over 55 trying to optimize the morning hormonal sequence, eliminating them is the cleaner choice. Here is something important I want to mention before giving you the practical protocol, and it connects the coffee timing problem to something you are probably not doing at all. One of the most consistently documented findings in circadian biology over the last decade is that morning light exposure is a critical biological synchronizer of the cortisol awakening response. Getting direct light into your eyes within the first 15 to 30 minutes of waking, even on an overcast day, even just standing near an open window, helps calibrate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the chain of command that produces your cortisol signal. Researchers have found that cortisol awakening responses are more robustly expressed in people who get morning light, compared with people who remain in dim indoor lighting. This means that if you wake up, go immediately to a dim kitchen, stare at a phone screen under artificial lighting, and drink coffee before the cortisol cycle has completed, you have made three simultaneous errors. The light problem compounds the caffeine timing problem, and the solution to the light problem is to stand outside or near an east-facing window for 5 minutes. Not a light therapy lamp, not a supplement. 5 minutes and a window. I find this mildly absurd in the way I find most of this material mildly absurd. The information exists. The research is published. The intervention costs nothing and takes 5 minutes. The reason it's not common knowledge is that there is no business model for recommending that someone go stand by a window, and there is a large and profitable business model for selling them another supplement, another device, another optimized morning beverage. Before I give you the 90-minute car reset, I want to tell you about something my husband put together because it connects directly to everything we've covered today. I had read all of this. I had read the cortisol timing research, the autophagy literature, the glycemic variability studies. I had bookmarked papers, I understood the mechanisms, and I still could not translate it into a consistent morning practice because understanding a biological mechanism and building a daily structure around it are two entirely different cognitive tasks. My husband is a more structural thinker than I am, and he had his own very clear reasons to get this right after what he went through. He spent months taking everything I kept reading and turning it into something functional, something you could follow at 6 in the morning when your prefrontal cortex is not yet running at full capacity. He called it the Noon Reset Protocol. It is a 30-day daily companion, 2 pages per day, one that explains what is happening in your body on that specific day of the protocol, one that you use as a tracker. He built it around 4 phases: adaptation, activation, optimization, and acceleration, because the hormonal and metabolic shifts that happen across the first 30 days are not linear, and the things that are challenging on day 4 are different from what's challenging on day 16. He also included a 40-question FAQ built from every question I asked during those early weeks, because the questions that come up on day 3 are very specific and you want answers that do not require you to go searching. There are 25 breakfast meal ideas with exact protein counts, which matters because protein quantity at your first meal of the day is one of the strongest levers for blood sugar stability through the afternoon. The details are in the description, and it costs less than a restaurant lunch, which, given how long he spent building it, is honestly a little embarrassing. Now, the 90-minute KR reset. The name refers to 3 components: cortisol, adenosine, and reset. Each one addresses a different point in the morning hormonal sequence, and they only work correctly when all 3 are operating together. The first component is the wait. No caffeine for the first 90 minutes after waking. 90 minutes is the window over which the cortisol awakening response peaks and begins its natural arc of decline, based on the body of research on car timing developed at institutions including the University of Trier in Germany, which has produced some of the foundational work on morning cortisol measurement. You are not removing coffee from your day. You are allowing the first shift crew to finish its work before the second crew arrives. During those 90 minutes, drink water immediately upon waking. Your body is mildly dehydrated after 8 hours without fluid, and dehydration amplifies cortisol. Get light exposure within the first 15 minutes if possible. Move even briefly. A 5-minute walk around the block activates a secondary, healthy cortisol pulse through mild physical stress, supports early adenosine clearance, and begins calibrating the circadian clock through temperature and movement cues. If 90 minutes is genuinely not workable with your schedule, 60 minutes is meaningfully better than zero. The cortisol peak in most people has occurred and begun declining before 45 minutes. Getting past the peak before adding caffeine is the minimum effective threshold. The second component is the clean cup, black coffee or coffee with a single tablespoon of heavy cream, not a flavored creamer, not oat milk with added sugars, not any product that lists corn syrup, rice syrup, or cane sugar in the first three ingredients on the label. The goal is to maintain the low insulin state that allows autophagy to continue operating and that prevents the cortisol-insulin double hormonal hit. Heavy cream in small quantities works because its carbohydrate content is minimal. A tablespoon contains less than half a gram of carbohydrate, which is insufficient to trigger a meaningful insulin response in the overwhelming majority of people. This is a practical compromise for people who genuinely cannot drink black coffee and would otherwise revert to flavored creamer. The biological precision here is that the specific damage comes from the sugar and processed additives, not from fat. The third component is the hard stop. Your last coffee of the day should be consumed no later than 8 hours before your target sleep time. If you target sleep at 10 in the evening, your last coffee is at 2 in the afternoon. If you sleep at 11, no coffee after 3. This is non-negotiable for anyone over 55 who is serious about sleep quality. Because of the extended caffeine half-life we discussed, caffeine's most damaging sleep effect is its suppression of slow-wave sleep, the deep, restorative sleep stage where growth hormone is secreted, where cellular repair is prioritized, where the brain consolidates memories and clears the amyloid proteins associated with Alzheimer's pathology. Research from the University of California, Berkeley, from Matthew Walker's sleep laboratory, has shown that even caffeine consumed 6 hours before bedtime reduces slow-wave sleep measurably. Disrupted slow-wave sleep is one of the fastest accelerators of cognitive aging in the scientific literature. The energy cost of one bad night of sleep in terms of inflammatory markers, cortisol regulation the following morning, and cognitive performance is real and measurable, and it circles back and makes the caffeine timing problem worse the next day. The single most common error that invalidates all three components simultaneously: doing the 90-minute wait, but then drinking 3 additional cups of coffee between 10 and 4 to compensate for the later start. This improves the morning cortisol sequence and then destroys sleep architecture. The three components are not interchangeable adjustments that you can apply selectively. They address 3 different biological problems at 3 different points across the day. Optimizing the first without the third is like patching a leak on the left side of the boat while opening a valve on the right side. I want to leave you with something honest about why this is actually hard to implement even when you understand it clearly. Changing a morning habit, especially a pleasurable, warm sensory habit that has been part of your routine for decades, is not primarily a biology problem. It is a psychology problem layered on top of an environment problem. The reason people read information like this, understand it, believe it, and still wake up the next morning and make the same coffee the same way is not a failure of intelligence or willpower. It is that habits are encoded neurologically in the basal ganglia, and the morning coffee ritual carries emotional and sensory architecture that is completely separate from the caffeine chemistry. The smell, the warmth of the cup, the quiet moment before the day starts, the Pavlovian signal to the brain that it is safe to wake up now. Removing that ritual without replacing it with something equally tangible in the sensory register is a behavioral design failure, and most health information simply ignores this reality entirely. The practical solution: during the 90-minute wait, drink something warm. Hot water with a wedge of lemon. Herbal tea if you like it. Hot water with a small pinch of sea salt and a few drops of citrus, which sounds odd until you try it on a cold morning. The goal is to preserve the ritual, the cup, the warmth, the seated quiet moment, while the cortisol cycle runs its clean arc. Then, at the 90-minute mark, the coffee you actually drink hits differently, Most people who try this with genuine consistency for 2 weeks report that the coffee feels more effective when timed correctly. That is not placebo. Adenosine has been naturally clearing for 90 minutes. Cortisol has peaked and begun declining. Caffeine arriving into that biological environment is doing exactly what it was designed to do, extending and amplifying the second energy phase of the morning, rather than crashing into the peak of the first. There is something almost structurally absurd about the fact that the most widely consumed psychoactive substance in human history is almost universally consumed at the worst possible time for its mechanism to work. The feeling that you can't function without your immediate morning coffee is not evidence that you are unusually caffeine dependent. It is evidence that your natural cortisol awakening response has been progressively suppressed by years of the external signal consistently overriding it before it could complete its own cycle. That is a trainable biological system. It adapts to inputs, change the input, and it readapts. The first several days of that transition involve genuine discomfort. The adenosine debt is real. The adjusted cortisol response takes time to reestablish. But the system on the other side of those 2 to 3 weeks is your own hormonal architecture doing its actual job, producing morning alertness, managing inflammation, protecting the cellular machinery that determines how fast you age. One last thought, because I think it matters. None of what I've described today is exotic. It is not a supplement stack. It is not a biohacking intervention requiring expensive equipment. It is a timing adjustment and a label reading habit. The barrier to doing it is entirely psychological and environmental, and the primary psychological barrier is that no one in your life has ever explained why it matters at the level of mechanism, only at the level of vague recommendation. Now you have the mechanism. Wait 90 minutes. Drink it clean. Stop 8 hours before sleep. That is the 90-minute care reset. Write it somewhere you will see it at 6 in the morning, because that is exactly the moment when the habit will attempt to override the knowledge. If you are starting the care reset this week, comment care reset below. I want to see who is actually doing this, and if questions come up around day 3 or 4, ask them in the comments and I will answer specifically. Subscribe, because next week I'm going into the one sleep supplement that major pharmaceutical trials now show is counterproductive after 60, and the natural alternative that actually deepens slow-wave sleep instead of suppressing